This lecture is for survey research. Surveys are used to gather two different kinds of information. Number one, the aimed at gathering factual information such as number of smokers, drinkers, use of specific consumer products, and so on and so. Okay. And then also, surveys are used to gather information, collect information about people's state of mind, such as attitude and belief. Across these different kinds of survey, however, there are some common underlying assumption that people are telling the truth. Without the survey response, as a collect data cannot be trusted. So here is a common sense based assumption about how people respond to survey. So the question is asked, and then people have a memory where they store knowledge about facts, or they have an attitude or belief. And then the question, in response to the question, people spit out a response which reflect their knowledge on facts or their belief about their own attitude and beliefs. However, is this really true? Is a question. More sophisticated understanding of people's survey response or process underlying people's survey response is more complicated. First, the question needs to be perceived, and then it needs to be processed cognitively for interpretation. And then people have all these different kinds of bias, either motivation or cognition. So therefore, people are actually improvising moment by moment a response based on many of these factors such as social desirability, cognitive bias, mood, situation, motivation, and therefore you as a psychologist trying to rely on survey to gather information from people needs to be aware some bias and the specific way in which survey questions can be improved to get more accurate data. That's what we're going to talk about. So in this slide, I listed some of the important information to consider for you when you are constructing survey. Okay. So number one, you need to consider whether or not the survey questions are about factual information or attitude or belief. You also need to think about question wording. Also, question order or organization of the survey question affect the response to a survey question. Response format, such as closed response or open-ended format, or response scale. And also, you need to think about format of survey administration, such as face-to-face versus phone versus mail or internet, also group versus individual. All these things affect quality of survey response. And so in the following discussion, we are going to talk about some of the specific issues associated with each of these different kinds of aspects of survey. People's response to survey questions are affected by bias. And the way in which those biases affect people's response may be slightly different between whether the question is about factual information or about attitude information. Okay, so the potential bias influencing the response to factual question would be social desirability bias, like people likely to answer certain questions in accordance with the social norms, such as how many hours do you watch TV, and what kind of discipline they use for child education, and drug usage, how many cigarettes that you smoke, so on and so on. Now also, memory bias should affect the accuracy of the people's response. For example, availability heuristics indicate that certain things are easier to remember. And so these are the things that you need to consider for the factual question. On the other hand, for the questions about attitude, certain social norm and social desirability affects, because certain beliefs are more acceptable in the society, okay? And then also, the other important things in case that your question is belief or attitude is whether or not those attitude and belief is pre-existing, or you need to actually think about the possibility that belief or attitude may be actually formed at the time of thinking about a question. So in that case, the actual question may influence the type of attitude or belief the people report, because that may be formed on the basis of question. Question wording affects the way in which people respond to a question. So I listed some of the key idea or concepts that we are going to talk about in the following slide. Number one is the simplicity of wording. Second is the double-barrel question, which means asking two or more questions in one sentence. Loaded question, its use of emotionally loaded wording. And then finally, how use of negation in question makes the response more complicated. Here we talk about the case of double-barrel question. So this means asking two or more things in one question. Should senior citizens be given more money for recreation center and food assistance program? So obviously, this is a problematic because there are two things asked. So whatever the response that people give, you don't know whether or not it's the response is about the first thing or second thing, or first things and second things together. So it makes it very difficult for researchers to interpret the meaning of the response. So here is an issue about loaded question. What do we mean by loaded question? Look at this example. Do you favor eliminating the wasteful excess in public school spending? What is the actual gist or the idea this question is trying to ask? It may be biased due to these words such as wasteful excess in public school fund spending. But on the other hand, maybe the question is intended to actually ask for people's opinion about wasteful excess in public school spending. So this is the part that you need to think about very carefully. Okay, so let's think about this a little deeper using the different kinds of examples. So let's say, do you favor increasing government revenue to pay for new roads versus do you favor increasing taxes to pay for new roads? So taxes and revenues refers to actually the same thing. And because the most of the revenue for the government is basically the taxes in a different form. But when asked in terms of revenue, it sounds somewhat different than when it's asked using the word taxes. So which one is going to give you more accurate response? Probably depends. So you need to think about what do you really want to know, and then needs to decide and justify which word should be used. So here is another one that you need to pay attention to is actually use of negation in a sentence. Do you feel that city should not approve the proposed women's shelter? So I want you to contrast this with, do you feel that city should approve the proposed women's shelter? Which one is easier for you to process and come up with a response? Negation somehow make it more difficult to understand the meaning. So I'm going to give you another example. Which of the following is actually correct, given what you believe about head injury? No head injury is too trivial to ignore. No head injury is too trivial to treat. My understanding based on the research as well as my personal experience with the student responses, they often think these two sentences mean the same thing, even though the main verb, which is ignore in the first and treat in the second sentence, is a complete opposite. This actually reveals that people may not be collectively processing the meaning of these sentences. So in turn, this suggests that you should avoid using negation in sentence when you are constructing survey questions. Here's another example of different kinds of words are used to ask similar question. Do you think the US should forbid public speeches against democracy? Versus, do you think the US should allow public speeches against democracy? Forbid and allow is an antonym, meaning it's an opposite thing. But the data suggests, okay, 54% answered yes to question number 1. This means 54% should answer no to the second question because it's an opposite. However, the data shows it's actually 75% answered no to question number 2. So this shows actually allow is not exact opposite of forbid. People seems to actually change mind, or people who are less clear about this issue somewhere in the middle, which may have shifted. That's 21% that shifted their opinion. So therefore, you really need to make sure what you want to know, and then the possibility that different kinds of question use or word may bias people to think in one way or the other. Another important thing that you need to consider is that the fact that in survey, usually the multiple questions are asked sequentially in specific order. Okay, so an order may affect people's response to individual question. Let's look at this example used from the past research. So how happy are you with life in general? That's a general question that's asked. Then how often do you normally go on date? And then you're supposed to answer the question number 2 with a specific times, like 2 times, 3 times. So when question 1, however, came after question 2, this means general question follow the specific questions. The relation between question and 1, the response to these 2 questions appear to become very similar. So think about this in a more specific way. Let's imagine that you asked, how often do you normally go on date? You're going to answer how many times a month. And then you asked, how happy are you with life in general? Do you notice that as if the how happy are you with life in general is actually referring to how often do you go on date? So therefore, they tend to converge to similar answer. It creates a simulation effect when the general question asked after the specific question. On the other hand, when the general question is asked before the specific question, the response to these 2 questions actually diverge, has no relations between them. So this creates the problem of how you interpret the meaning of general question depending on what questions are asked right before that general question, introducing another error, another kind of error into the overall survey. So here is another example. There are 2 different questions, and so do you think the US should let communist newspaper reporters from other countries come here and send the information back to the newspapers as they see it? Because the US people, citizens in 1950s are afraid of, anxious about Russia, they didn't like it. So therefore, 36% said yes. However, the researchers asked the second question to these same people. Do you think a communist country like Russia should let American newspaper reporters come in? To which that 90% said yes. That's understandable. But more interesting is when the second questions are given first, and then they are asked to respond to the first question, their response to the first question changed. Now, it's actually 66% said yes. 73% said yes to question number 1 when question 1 followed by question number 2. So what's going on? So the one interpretation is when the question 1 is asked in isolation, the meaning of the question is about the national security. But on the other hand, if the question 1 is asked after the question number 2, the meaning of the question becomes consistency or fairness, or the freedom of press. Therefore, their actually response changed. So overall, what's important is this actually poses a question. Is the meaning of a question is in the question, or is the meaning itself changes depending on the context? I would like you to think about this in seriously, because this really affects how you should construct the survey. Here we talk about the possible influence of question format, namely open-ended versus closed-ended format. What do you think is the most important problem facing this country at present? In the research reported, it's 22% actually said fuel and energy shortage because of extremely cold winter in there. However, which of these is the most important problem facing this country at present, and included option is unemployment, crime, inflation, quality of leaders, breakdown of morals and religions. Only 1 out of 593 mentioned energy shortage. So this implies that in case that you would like to conduct a survey with a closed response, you need to pilot the survey such that all the possible response that participants may provide is covered in the response options. Another example of response format or is a response format where it's actually scales within the format. Okay, set 1 covered from up to half an hour to more than 2.5 hours. Set 2 covered 2.5 hours to more than 4.5 hours. And then a question was, how many hours a day do you spend watching TV? So when the set 1 was given, 16% watched more than 2.5 hours. Okay, whereas if the set 2 is given, 38% watched more than 2.5 hours. So people are, what's actually implicated here is actually people are not really thinking about it, may not be thinking about exactly how many hours they are likely to watch TV. Okay, but they kind of possibilities, they tend to think that they are the average people. So average means right in the middle in the scale. Therefore, 2.5 hours is very, very extreme to according to the set 1. So therefore, only 16% choose that. But on the other hand, according to the set 2, 2.5 hours are maybe actually lower than the middle. So therefore, more people choose it. So this clearly shows that the people are actually gathering information from the survey format itself or scale itself to think about what is the norm. This is an important question when you make a survey questions. Often the survey response is numbered, but there are 2 different kinds of numbered questions. One type is even numbered question, which is often called signal detection scale, which forces the people's response to divide in between either negative or positive without allowing neutral response. On the other hand, the odd numbered question scale, such as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, allow people to choose neutral response located in the middle. Which one is better? So here are some considerations that I would like you to consider. So many people choose neutral when they don't care enough about survey because they think they don't care, or they are right in the middle. And so if that is an assumption, even numbered survey scale may be better option because it forces them to really think about which way they are located on. But on the other hand, if you use even numbered survey, you may actually bias, therefore you are going to get the inaccurate response from these people who truly do not care or truly who do not have an opinion. So which one is the better is probably depending on your assumption about what kind of people and what is the prevalent responses. So you need to think about both pro and con when selecting either even numbered or odd numbered scales. So in constructing survey, it's very important for you to pilot. Uh, for example, the best way to pilot is to ask the question using the survey to your friend or somebody, and then you try to find the discrepancy between what your intended meaning of the question versus what's the actual interpretation of these the people with whom that you are refining the survey. And based on that, you are going to refine the survey questions to narrow down the survey interpretation of the questions as intended. So here is a larger issue or a more extended discussion or thinking that I would like to do in relation to refining the survey questions. So in survey, all the participants needs to be asked the same question in the same way to make survey data reliable and valid. Okay, so that's an assumption. Otherwise, the people's response across the different survey occasions are not comparable and cannot be treated in the same way. However, is it possible for all the people to interpret the question in the same way? Okay, so this leads to a question, the big question. Language is inherently ambiguous, so the critical question is, should we make the delivery of the actual question the same? Okay, or should we make the interpretation of the meaning of the question by survey respondent the same? Okay, so obviously the goal is the interpretation should be the same, but is it possible? Okay, so also it's related is if you provide the overall goal of the survey, does it include the accuracy of the interpretation of each individual question by survey respondent? These are all very complicated questions, and I don't think there is no clear and a simple answer. I'm just giving you as a food for thought that I would like to think. Okay. Finally, format of survey is going to affect the quality or different kinds of bias. So for example, written format, it's less costly and less time consuming than interviews, but can you really get the accurate response because you don't have any control over how the question is interpreted. Interview involves an interaction with the people. It can be face-to-face or telephone interview. So in that case, it allows the survey participants to ask you questions about what the survey means, or when they do not understand. However, there is different kinds of bias. Okay, the social desirability is probably more likely to be more prevalent when the survey is in face-to-face. Okay, and face-to-face interview is very expensive and time-consuming. Okay, and then finally, focus group is a small group of individuals during a short period of time, and open-ended questions are used to the group, and they can freely talk about their own opinions and things like that. So you need to think about which format is the most appropriate based on the survey research question. Survey can be given or administered multiple times to monitor or examine the change across different times. This is called a panel study. So this is a recap of statistics. As you can see, again, this is a recap of the statistics. So when keeping the confidence interval constant, such as 95%, the margin of error increases as the sample size decreases. So again, the larger the sample size, the more accurate the survey, the data will be. Okay, and that's the main point that I would like you to remember. So this slide is aimed at recapping your memory of uh, statistics. The most important, however, is the last part in this slide. The most important in the context of psychological research is that your sample needs to be representative of the population that you're interested in. Otherwise, even if you are able to compute margin of error and confidence interval, that's inaccurate because the margin of error, you remember that it's often like a standard error of the mean, is based on the standard deviation of your sample. And if your sample standard deviation is not accurate estimate of the population standard deviation, the entire value is actually inaccurate. So, in the previous slide, I already talked about why your sample needs to be representative sample. So I'm not going to talk about this in kind of anymore here. I would like you to take a look at the content of this slide and think about this one more time. In that way, this is going to help. It's going to help you remember the importance of representative sample, not just the fact, but why that's important. So in the previous slides, we talked about the importance of obtaining representative sample. So representative sample can be obtained when you use probability sampling, which means each member of the population has a specified and it's equal probability of being selected as a sample. This results in representative sample, and random sampling is the probability sampling. Okay. On the other hand, when it's non-probability sampling, such as convenience sample, then the sample that you obtain is actually biased. So it's not guaranteed to have representative sample. There are two specific techniques, or actually more, but we are going to talk about only two. Two specific techniques to produce representative sample. So that's a probability sampling. Simple random sampling. So in this case, every member of the population has an equal probability of being selected. However, the weakness or limitation of the simple random sampling is when the minority is very small, or such as very specific subgroup whose occurrence is very, very small, even if all the member in the population has an equal chance of make it to the sample, the very small minority often are neglected or not included. In order to actually address this issue, the more complicated technique called stratified random sampling is available. In the stratified random sampling, you are going to stratify the people into different subgroups, including different kinds of minority. And then random sampling is applied into each strata. For example, the majority is, for example, male and female, but there are transgenders and other minority groups. So it creates the strata, and so that all the different kinds of minority groups are guaranteed to make it to the final sample. The only difference is it's randomly selected from each strata. Okay? Stratified random sampling therefore ensures more accurate representation of the subgroup in overall sample, but it's more expensive. So we would like to talk about. So I'm going. So do you need to? So here in this final slide, I